This is Ham Radio Perspectives, and I am Quinn, K8QS.
And again, I'm Tom, W89TDD.
Okay, this time we're getting a little bit philosophical here because we're trying to see if we can answer a question that has been asked in the hobby of ham radio from the very beginning. Why are there so fewer women compared to men in ham radio? And we're going to look at that, tell you what we think the best that we can do. We would like to see that there are more women in ham radio. In fact, I was thinking, Tom, as we were working on preparation for this, that I don't ever recall on sideband working a DX station that was a woman. This is not just a U.S. phenomenon. This is a worldwide phenomenon. People talk today about the gender gap. We're not trying to get into all of the fancy language that people are using today, saying there should be parity, equal numbers, or all of that. We're not doing that. We're just trying to understand this a little bit together and also look at what some of the research says about it. So in the radio community, it has always been a well-known topic. We didn't go into QRZ and look up how many times people posted about this, but it's probably a lot. And of course, historically, in the hobby, you had language to refer to women versus men. You had young lady, which was meant primarily for an unmarried woman. And then you had XYL, which some men will not use now, and a lot of women don't like it if they're married. X young lady, as if they're no longer young. And then you have, of course, OM for old man. And sometimes that's still used in CW. I don't hear it in phone the way I used to when we were on early in the hobby. But the best estimates that we could come up with are that about 15% or less of ham radio operators, depending on region around the world, are women, and the number fluctuates a little bit. There's not probably a single reason for this, the disparity. So you look at what are the sociologists saying about it, the hobby historians, and to some extent we're hobby historians, and the clubs that look at this that are trying to recruit women into the local clubs, they have something to say too. So what's the first reason that we found for this, Tom?
Well, I think historically there's echoes of the old boys club legacy. Amateur radio grew out of early 20th century engineering, military communications, maritime wireless industries, fields that were almost exclusively male at the time. Over the decades, though, local radio clubs and shortwave networks naturally, formed around these demographics.
Yeah, because hobbies, often spread through these peer networks. Within a hobby. And so when you have a group of people of a certain kind, let's say in this case, men who are interested in electronics, it will tend to attract other men who are interested in electronics. You've also got a factor there of a father-son mentoring. You find a lot of hams when you get around in the hobby that got their sons involved, or their sons kind of seeing what their dads were doing with the hobby, passed along male to male. So that goes on. And so this heavily male-dominated kind of environment became self-perpetuating. We're not saying that's all bad. It's good. It keeps the hobby going. But walking into a local club meeting, a ham club today, and you find a room, let's say, that's 90% male, and often older males at the clubs, not all, some clubs are really attracting a lot of younger folks, it can still feel kind of intimidating for a woman to go into a club meeting like that. And you also find often at the clubs, the women who are there are married to men who are in the club.
Right.
So it can be a little bit intimidating for women, and especially for women that are newer to the hobby. Now, there's also the how shall we put this? This is sociological now, gang. The traditional ham shack, that is, isolation versus social interaction. Oh, I noticed when I looked at the research for a different thing I was working on at the time, that when you look at the sciences, and especially into electronics, related sciences, you find that it's overwhelmingly people who are introverted rather than extroverted. Okay, so that's the way it is. And when I was in electronics engineering at the University of Illinois, it was overwhelmingly male in the class, very few women, and it was mostly introverts as well. It's kind of interesting. And so historically, ham radio was marketed and practiced as a solitary hobby, not necessarily something that you do with someone else. So you may work or talk to somebody else. So a person sitting alone in a basement or maybe a shack in the garage, tinkering with hardware. In other words, a solitary thing. And many hobby researchers point out, broadly speaking, men are often drawn to these kinds of hobbies that are focused on the mechanics of the technology itself, whereas women would often be more interested in the technology as a tool for communication or collaboration, or practical utility, rather than just playing around with the equipment. And however, ham radio needs members who can instill such qualities into the hobby. Research in my field of communication, by the way, Tom, and this is, of course, my field, and I know it well, and some people get upset when I say this, but it's truth. Men generally prefer to talk about things, right, and women tend to talk about relationships. So imagine if you're a woman and you get involved in ham radio, and let's say you get on the HF bands, you're going to find a lot of talk about things and not so much about relationships.
Yeah. True. One thing I can comment on about your the hobby being passed on from father to son is when I look up a profile of a young lady that I've communicated with, it's surprisingly the number of young women getting involved in the hobby have been brought to it from their father.
Yeah.
They're emulating their father's hobbies, which is goes against the very tradition of men passing it down from father to son. So I found that's a very interesting statistic that now women are picking up the hobby from their fathers. And, I digress, but the primary goal of the hobby is seen as simply making contact with a stranger to exchange signal reports and equipment details. And, that's the traditional DX contest. It can hold less appeal for those looking for deeper, social connections or a real world application for the communications. I don't know if there's any YL nets operating. I'm sure there are.
There are a few, yeah.
Where they're talking about technical details and so on and so forth, more than, homekeeping and social connections. But that's one area that needs.
Yes, like going to a club, Tom. It's a little intimidating, I think, if you're a woman, to get on 40 or 80 meters in the sideband areas and jump into one of those groups that are talking there. And I get that. So another thing is the outdated terminology and the related on-air culture. Ham radio as a hobby still carries some cultural remnants from its early days that can feel kind of alienating for women. Yeah, we talked about the terminology, the YL, the OM, the XYL, which women in the hobby have told me, don't you use that. Okay.
Don't go there.
Don't go there. While, originally it was intended to use these kinds of things in an endearing way as traditional jargon, some women today find these kinds of labels to be archaic and even maybe a little bit like a put down. So that's a problem. And there's also what we might call the microphone gatekeeping. Tell us about that, Tom.
Right. And that's a fairly common complaint among, female operators, that when they transmit, they're occasionally met with surprise, over enthusiasm or patronizing, mansplaining about their gear rather than just being treated as a peer. Conversely, some experience the opposite problem, being swarmed by a pileup of operators just because a female voice is rare on the frequency, which makes them feel like they're being put under a microscope.
I can't tell you how many times, Tom, I have heard a guy contacting a female on the air, and one of the questions he asks early on is, so how did you get involved in the hobby? And what's implied in that question is there's something not quite right to be female and be in the hobby, that you're an odd duck of sorts. Now, we may be overstating this a little bit. We don't mean to. We're just trying to point out some of the ways that we think, some of the things that contribute to ham radio being so overwhelmingly male compared to female. And here's the last one that really we think is particularly important. It's the STEM, the sciences, engineering, and so on, the STEM disparities that are already out there for the pipeline. So if a lot of hams come into ham radio through engineering and the other disciplines that are science related, and if those disciplines are represented overwhelmingly by men, then the pipeline will be men, because the licensing process of ham radio requires passing an exam covering electronics theory, a radio wave propagation, some math stuff, and there's a demographic split in this. And I've got friends that run college programs in computer science, in engineering, sometimes pre-med, and they wonder why they can't get more women. See, and this is part of the pipeline problem. So as more initiatives come along, I think through the college pipelines where they are attracting more women, then we're going to see this contributing to more females coming into the hobby.
So, it's interesting that currently 28, 30% of women are enrolled in STEM studies, and 20% are currently engineering, with that field steadily increasing. I've seen where it's been increasing by 20 to 35% annually of women getting into STEM careers. So the gender bias has been significantly reduced to like the maker movement, creating possible pool of increased interest in ham radio by women. What's also interesting is if you look back into the history of NASA, who were the mathematicians that actually put together the complex mathematical formulas, on a slide rule and on primitive computers to come up with, orbital statistics and anything having to do with the actual functioning in space? They were all women. Maybe not all women, but the ones who were the most creative were women.
Heavily, and that remains true now in NASA and other space projects where there are a lot of women involved that come through this STEM thing. The one other change that you might find interesting, gang, is that more and more men, as a percentage of the population, are deciding not to go to college. And so all colleges and universities are becoming higher percentage of females. And so that'll play a role too, STEM related, science stuff or not. But this is all shifting. We're rather hopeful about this. We're not saying that it would be great if we had 50% male, 50% female. I always enjoyed that as a teacher, to have a class that was like that. But, we could make a major difference in the hobby if we had 35, 40% women in the hobby, with all kinds of things that they would be doing and promoting, including helping with the development of the club scene, because women are going to do a better job forming and running a club, ham club, than men are. Tom and I have both complained about this together when, we're in Florida together or whatever, that we go to a lot of club meetings here or there where the men don't know how to run the meetings very well, unfortunately. And so we see this changing. I think Parks on the Air, Summits on the Air, all that stuff is making a difference as well. And it's great when I go out birding and I run across these people, and they are often couples that are doing it together.
So, furthermore, there's organizations like the Young Ladies Radio League, the YLRL, dedicated female-led, and that's on the HF and some VHF, UHF repeaters. And they provide, robust mentorship, ensuring that women coming into the hobby find a strong, supportive community right away. So see our video link below. It's an interview with a young woman very active in the hobby.
Yeah, and her father was a ham too. She fits into that group that you talked about.
Right.
And I think her brother was also, and maybe her mother, I can't remember, but we'll put a link to that. Incredible, brilliant on the science side. So it's so great to see that. At any rate, here are our thoughts on why there are so many more men than women in the hobby, but also our thoughts on some things that are changing that are likely to make a difference here. And so we're hopeful, and we would love to see more women in the hobby. If you're female and you watch this video, would you please put a note down below and tell us your thoughts about what we have said, but also correct us if you think we've gone off stream here because we don't understand the women's perspective adequately. And my wife tells me that I don't understand women's perspectives on anything, but that's another whole story. Thanks for watching. Please sign up here, become a member, by subscribing, give us a thumbs up, ring that bell when you get a new video, and we'd love to have all of your comments. This is Ham Radio Perspectives. I'm Quinn, K8QS.
And I'm Tom, W89TDD.
See you, everybody.